Good evening. We're coming near the end of this long process of creating the budget for the 2025-26 school year, and then that also goes hand in hand with the tax levy. So this process really comes to a conclusion at the end of this month. So we're going to quickly review where we've been and then talk about next steps and how the budget and tax levy can impact individual property owners here in the district. So a real quick review of the past few months, and if you attended our annual meeting, I want to thank you. We covered some of what you'll see here at the annual meeting, and now we're just expanding on a few key points and some common questions we get. So again, the preliminary budget was approved by the school board in June. State budget is signed into law after that. We've talked about kind of the oddness of that timing, but that's the case in every school district throughout Wisconsin. Throughout July and August, some preliminary state data is released that gets integrated into the budget. In September, we had our annual meeting where we proposed the budget as well as the levy. So the next steps are, in a couple of days is a big day every year. October 15th is when a lot of really critical data points get released by the state. Now we have preliminary numbers on all of these, but the final data gets released then. Sometimes they don't move at all from the preliminary data, and sometimes they move drastically. Then at the October 27th board meeting, the final budget and tax levy recommendation will come forward to the board for approval. And then upon approval, the levy information is sent to municipalities, which then prepare it to go out on tax bills in December. So some of the key highlights that we talked about at the annual meeting we've been talking about are the mill rate is projected to remain flat at $6.14. A balanced general fund budget is proposed, and the fund balance remains healthy. And for more information on those, please refer back to the annual meeting recording and slides. There's a lot of information in there about that. You'll recall this slide from the annual meeting. It is our mill rate history. So you'll see that even with referendum expenses included, our mill rate is still substantially below kind of that historical norm that you saw just, 4 or 5 years ago at $6.14. When you were back in these years here, you were hovering right around $8, just under or just over back then. So a couple of common questions I want to just go over tonight for everybody, and this is probably the most common question here. Does a flat mill rate mean my property tax bill will not change? And I would love for that to be an easy answer, but we're going to go through the implications of that. So the short answer is not necessarily. Your individual property tax bill can go up or down or stay the same if the mill rate stays flat. And we're going to talk about why. There's several factors that impact that. Below here, if you go on our website, and we have a lot of information about understanding how schools are funded, is the general simplified formula for how you calculate a mill rate. And we're going to break down a few of the factors that play a role into that help explain why it's not as easy as just saying, well, the mill rate stayed the same, so my taxes stay the same. It's not quite that simple. They might stay the same, they might go down, or they could go up. So let's talk about that. So there are some key factors here, 4 key factors that impact property tax bills. So one might be the change in that taxpayer's individual property value, okay? The next can be the change in your municipality's total property value. So let's say you live in the town of Barton, the total property value of all of the town of Barton, if that changes, that can impact your property tax bill. And then, to make it even more complex, the state formula also says, okay, it might be the change in your municipality's property tax value compared to the municipality right next to you that's also in the West Bend School District. So if you live in the town of Barton, well, maybe your property value stayed exactly the same, and you're like, hey, we must be staying the same. Well, not if next door in the city of West Bend, their property values went up or down. Now, in relation to them, there's a change, and that can adjust your property tax value. And then finally, that amount of tax levy, and that's whether it is any of the taxing authorities, whether the school district, the technical college, the county, the city, all of those impact what your bill is that you ultimately see on your tax bill. So when we talk about that first item, your individual property value, that can be impacted by a number of things. If you did an addition, construction project, that obviously leads to a change in assessment, which can change your property value and therefore result in a change in property taxes. A change in the condition can also impact, although those are far less common, or something that is more common, a reassessment, which you see every few years can really adjust an individual person's property value. So if any of those took place on your property over the last year, that might result in an impact on what your property tax bill is for the school district and all of the taxing authorities, regardless of the mill rate staying the same. So then we talk about the municipality as a whole, right, and what their property value is. And we'll look at some of those numbers in a moment, but who determines what that total is? So the State Department of Revenue determines that. So they look at all property values across the entire state and assess a total value for each municipality. Now, what is an interesting nuance to that is that some of the municipalities that we serve are actually split between multiple school districts. So, for example, the town of Polk is partly in the West Bend School District and then also broken into some other school districts, or several others that the town of Jackson, for example, is in multiple different school districts. So that becomes a nuance that also kind of complicates this. But they'll give a total amount of value to a municipality's property. This is the school, all the properties within the school district, the property value growth that we've seen over the years. The West Bend School District has had high property growth compared to the state average over several years. So for example, this year, the state average increase in property growth was high overall, 8% across the state, but in our school district, it's projected to be even greater than that at 9.3%. It's really a combination of factors that you can think play into property value in terms of strong economy here, strong access to jobs, and strong, well-maintained properties, as well as business expansion and things like that that are taking place in our community. All good things, all help spread the property tax levy across more properties, which can have a favorable impact on a property taxpayer, all other things being equal. I shared this graph at the annual meeting, but we're going to expand on it a little bit. This is the share of property value in the district by municipality. So certainly the city of West Bend is a large portion of our value, but it's actually only right about half. The other half of our property value is spread between the other several municipalities that we serve. You can see there that the property value increase projected by the state is to go from $8 billion for all property, all houses, businesses, everything in the whole district, to $8.7 billion this year. That number is not final, though. That number is one of those figures that comes out 2 days from now on October 15th. This is the projected change in those property values for each municipality for the coming year. So you can see they're all over the map, right? And this, when you look at that change, don't think that is a trend that plays, true for that municipality every year. So you see a huge increase in the town of Jackson, 14% increase property value. Some years the town of Jackson might be at the bottom of that increase. Okay, it's very dependent from year to year. But the reason this matters is that third point that we talked about, how much your municipality's property value increased compared to the others is going to substantially impact whether your tax bill stays the same, goes up, or goes down. And that's where we get to this fun chart that I am going to expand on a little bit. So we shared this at the annual meeting. This is the cumulative change in property value for our 5 largest municipalities going back to 2020. So you can see some years there's big jumps, right? So town of West Bend here in 23, 24 had a huge jump. They had a much larger increase in property value than the others. That probably, all other things being equal, would have resulted in a taxpayer in the town of West Bend having a larger increase in their property tax bill compared to maybe at that same time you can see this orange line, which is the city of West Bend, kind of flattened out. That might have meant that the city of West Bend taxpayers might have seen a decrease as the relation was very inverse there. So I have another graph that maybe explains that a little bit better. So here's what we anticipate this year, that increase in property value being by each municipality, right? So we talked about the town of Jackson being the highest at 14.4%. And then you see here, town of Polk being our lowest increase. I put a line here for what that average across the district we foresee being at 9.3%. Again, you can't predict it property by property. However, if you are down here in Polk's range, your property tax bill probably tends to veer more towards the lower end compared to some of the ones that are above the line, right? So City of West Bend this year is below the line. Does that mean all City of West Bend taxpayers are going to see a decrease in property taxes? No, it doesn't. but some of them might when you're looking at just that one factor of your property value in relation to others. Long and short of this is, when someone asks me, will my property taxes go up? The answer is, it's complicated. Let's look at your property, right? Because everybody's has its own unique set of factors, unique set of municipality factors, and unique set of municipality, comparative municipality factors, right? And I take those phone calls from citizens regularly, and we're happy to talk through that with citizens and explain how those numbers come together. So common question number 2, well, okay, maybe property taxes go up sometimes, but doesn't state aid help reduce my property taxes? And the answer is yes, if state aid increases. Okay, so let's talk about that. This year, state aid that was in the state budget did not increase for the first time in 8 years. Pretty unusual. Usually you'll see that happen in a year where maybe the state is facing a big deficit or something like that. You know, 2010, when Act 10 came down, the state was facing a $3 billion shortfall, right? This year, that wasn't the case, actually. The state was sitting on multiple billions in surplus, and actually, even after the state budget is still sitting on over $700 million in surplus. So it was somewhat unexpected that was just the route that they went, but they allocated those dollars in other ways, just not to state aid for schools. That same state budget increased the revenue limit by $325 per student, which means that increase in per student spending, since it's not coming from state aid, instead comes from property taxes. This is a phenomenon that is the same universally across all 421 school districts in Wisconsin. This is not a unique to West Bend situation. We have this on our website as well. It kind of simply breaks down, okay, what I just said. Where does our revenue limit authority come from? In general, it's coming from either state aid, sometimes called equalization aid or equalized aid, and property tax. Between those two, they add together to become the revenue limit authority of the district. Generally, if one goes up, the other goes down, and they're inversely related that way. So you also have to remember, let's say the state did increase the pot for equalization aid. I believe it's going to be $5.8 billion that the state allocates to all 421 school districts for equalization aid. So even if that goes up, the state aid funding formula has to also favor you to experience that. So even though state aid is not going up as a whole pot, some districts this year are seeing an increase. The majority are seeing a decrease. So 2/3 of school districts in the state are receiving less state aid this year than they did last year due to how the funding formula works. That means those 2/3 of districts will have to shift more of the tax burden over to the property tax end versus the state aid side of that formula. We are in preliminary projections in July from the state projecting about a 5.5% in aid reduction in aid for the West Bend School District. So we are in that 2/3 of districts. Another one of those big numbers that's going to come out in 2 days. Here is the history of equalization aid, so you can see it really does fluctuate. This is for our district, not across the state, so depending on how the funding formula works for us, we can see increases, decreases. It is dependent on a wide range of factors that would take us quite a while to go through tonight. So why is the West Bend School District receiving less state aid, which causes more of a shift towards the property tax side? For a number of reasons. That strong property value growth in our district actually works against you in the state aid formula. Basically, the state aid formula tries to prioritize first districts that perhaps have lower property values because of perhaps their that community's less ability to pay for the cost of schools. Another piece that factors in is when you have more cost per student, that actually works in your favor often in the funding formula. Well, other districts are increasing their costs faster than the West Bend School District. That's not really a choice of ours per se. We pretty much tax to what the revenue limit authority is. However, when you hear about all of these operational referendums happening in different districts, that increases those districts' costs and actually will favor a school district in the state aid funding formula, which is a little odd. They have to be of a certain type of property value, but for example, probably what's impacting more school districts across the state more than anything is So the West Bend School District's projection is a decrease of around $1.8 million in state aid. Milwaukee Public Schools, which passed a large operational referendum, is projecting more than a $77 million increase in state aid on top of their operational referendum. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that since their cost per student is increasing and their property value per student is low, the aid formula funnels more money in their direction, right? So all of these major operational and facility referendums you see throughout the state, they actually draw more funding away from the pot because those referendum funds are considered shared dollars for all of the state. And that means state aid decreases for districts like ours. Now you might say, didn't we pass a facilities referendum? And that is true, which really speaks to the fact that even in spite of our increased cost with the facilities referendum, our costs are still not keeping pace with what the average is increased costs across the state of Wisconsin, which is fascinating, right? So for us, shows good. We are investing in our facilities, but we're also cost per student staying below where the average is across the state. So, good stewardship. Again, a lot of those things are kind of out of our control, but it does show that we're, offering our programs and providing our taxpayers a good value. So are some other districts in the area seeing this phenomenon of less state aid? The answer is yes. So there's 8 school districts in Washington County. Only 1 district is projecting an increase. The average of the other 7 districts, including West Bend, is basically a 10% decrease in state aid. So this is not a phenomenon that is unique to us. And then I shared this chart at the annual meeting as well. This shows how state aid has increased, the blue line and the left axis. So it's been increasing pretty consistently for several years. But the red line is how much aid the West Bend School District has been receiving, and that's represented on the right axis. So really, that state funding formula has not really resulted in this increase in the general pool of dollars the state has allocated really being directed towards our community. And instead, you've probably seen a larger share heading towards property tax. However, due to the management of the mill rate that we've had, we've still been able to lower the mill rate from where it was back here when it was in the $8 range. In spite of that flat, overall aid number, we've been able to manage the mill rate and actually reduce it by over $1. So that's a lot of information, but hopefully it makes clear that it's not a simple answer to those questions. We do project the mill rate to be flat. We will know for sure how that lands on Wednesday when all that data comes out, but our current projection is for that to remain flat, and then we'll come forward with that final budget and levy recommendation 2 weeks from now. So, Mr. Pickler, you're an accountant, maybe you enjoyed that more than most people who are watching, but hopefully it explained some of the nuance to the funding and how your tax dollars end up funding our schools.